Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Asphalian's joint webinar with MMGC and Vera Rosas, Argentina, Brazil, and EUMedical Device and IVDs Regulatory Insights. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. And last but not least, Fran Rodriguez, Medical Device Manager and Lead Auditor at Asphalian's MedTech Unit, PhD in Biomedicine focused on regulatory science and postgraduate studies in medical device expertise, specialized in substance-based medical devices, borderline products, software, in vitro diagnosis medical devices, and drug device combinations. In today's webinar, they will guide you through the EU and Latin America regulatory frameworks, helping you navigate complexity, avoid common pitfalls, and accelerate your market access. Our colleague Miguel will talk briefly about Asphalion services. Miguel, please.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Welcome, everyone. I'm Miguel Canovas. I'm from the Business Development Division in Asphalion MedTech. And as Lydia said, I would like to briefly introduce Asphalion and our role in the medical device and vitro diagnostic sector. Asphalion supports companies throughout the full product life cycle, from early development activities to certain and post-market phases. Frank, can you please pass the slide, please? Our goal is to help manufacturers navigate regulatory requirements efficiently and achieve successful access to the European. The next one, please. We work across key regulatory areas such as technical documentation, risk management, CE marking processes, post-market surveillance, and strategic regulatory planning. We also provide support in quality management system, clinical and preclinical development planning, and interaction with relevant authorities and notified bodies. Overall, and to sum up this introduction, our approach is to act dedicated partner, helping companies transform regulatory complexity into a clear and structured market access strategy. If I turn to Fran, thank you very much to be here, everyone.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Lydia, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining in today's webinar. I'm Francisco Rodriguez, and I will be starting with the revision of MedTech regulatory requirements applicable for the European Union. So this is an overview of the table of content that we will discuss in today. As Lydia mentioned in the chat, please, if you have any question, do not hesitate to let us know through this email address, and we will come back to you with our answers. So first of all, talking about the medtech industry in Europe, we have currently a legal framework that is finishing its transition period with the previous legal framework governed by the so-called Medical Device Directive. But currently, for the purposes of today's webinar, we will be focusing on the efficient, by today, legal frameworks, which are basically, on the one hand, the Regulation 2017-745 for medical devices, or the so-called MDR, and on the other hand, the Regulation 2017-746, or the also known as IVDR, for in vitro diagnosis medical devices. So what does this mean by showing compliance with these legal frameworks in the European Union? So basically, by complying with these regulations, you will be, as manufacturer, able to affix a symbol directly to your device, which is the well-known CE mark. This CE mark symbol is the representation that you have complied with the regulations of your product, and also it will automatically allow the freely distribution of your devices throughout the whole European Economic Area. This area includes the 27 member states, also Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, and also we have ancillary agreements with Croatia and Turkey. So if you show compliance with the regulation, you have the CE mark and you can reach all these markets at one point. So which type of technology or products are covered actually by these two regulations? So for this, we need to review exactly which is the definition of medical device regulatory category and in vitro diagnosis medical device exactly in the wording of each regulation. So starting for the first part, a medical device regulation, the MDR, includes this definition for a medical device. Basically, as you can see in the slide, it includes a wide range of products moving between an instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, and I would say along, etc. That all of them have in common that they are intended by the manufacturer to be used in human for any of the following specific medical purposes. And then the definition includes examples, different type of medical purposes. Up to here, you may wonder that for some cases, for example, substance-based product, there could be an overlapping with other regulatory category, which is the one for medicinal product. So the point for differentiating with this regulatory category is the second part of the definition, which includes that the medical device cannot achieve its primary intended action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. There could be these actions, but they need to be ancillary or secondary to a primary mechanical or physical action. On the other hand, we have the definition of in vitro diagnosis medical device. In this case, again, the definition includes a list of the different typologies of product that could be covered by this definition, that all of them needs to have in common that they are intended to be used in vitro, therefore non-invasive by definition, to examine in vitro sample obtained from the human body, and also to provide information based on the analysis of those samples of medical nature. And then it has different example of information that can be obtained for medical purposes by the use of an IVD. Also, once you have identified that your technology is actually mapping with the definition of a medical device or an IVD in accordance with the European regulations, you need to assess which is the applicable risk classification to your product. Because depending on this risk classification, the number of requirements and also the conformity assessment procedure would be defined. Basically, for conducting this risk classification, you need to know, first of all, that devices are categorized into 4 risk classes. In the case of medical devices, ranging from class 1 to class 3, and in the case of IVDs, ranging from class A to class D. The principle for deciding which is the applicable risk classification is by the application of several classification rules, 22 in the case of the MDR and 7 in the case of the IVDR. And basically, you need to choose which is the applicable risk classification depending on primarily the intended purpose of your device. The most important thing about the risk classification is that as I said, it will define the applicable conformity assessment process. So for the case of class 2A, class 2B, and class 3 devices, and also the class 1 devices that are intended to be reusable, sterile, or with a measuring function, these devices will need the involvement of a third party, which is called the notified body, for the obtention of the CE mark. Okay. In the case of the class 1, they can be automatically self-certified directly by the manufacturer. The same applies for the IVDs, but in this case, the notified bodies are required for those classified between class B, class C, or class D. For those devices that are class A, they can be certified by the manufacturer itself. So we have a comment about notified bodies, but what are actually European notified bodies and how they differ from competent authorities. So notified bodies are public or private companies that are designated by the competent authorities of the member state where they are established. And basically, these are the regulatory bodies responsible for assessing the compliance of a medical device, remember, higher than class 1 or higher than class A, with the applicable legal framework, the MDR or the IVDR as applicable. So these will be the entities that will be at the end affixing the CE mark to your device. You as manufacturer can decide on which notified body you want to work with. there is no restriction regardless the country where you are established. The CE mark that you will obtain from any of these notified bodies will be working for the whole European Economic Area, as we commented at the beginning. Also, I wanted to make the difference with the competent authorities, because for the competent authorities, the main role in the medtech industry in Europe arrives when the products are already CE marked, because the competent authorities are the main entities responsible for the post-market surveillance activities. So when we think about a pre-CE mark phase, we need to think about primarily on notified bodies, but once we have the CE mark obtained from our device, we need to maintain the CE mark with the notified body, but in addition, we need to work together with competent authorities for the PMS activities. How to choose notified bodies? I want to make a specific focus on this part because, as said, you can freely choose the notified bodies that better works for you. But I need to add to this a requisite that the notified bodies need to be designated for having the expertise to assess your device in particular. Bear in mind that the medical device sector is really varied. As I said, there could be a different typology, a wide range of products governed by the same regulation. Therefore, not all notified bodies are designated for having the capacity to assess all types of devices. So first of all, you need to review which is what they call NDR code or the IVDR code. This is the code assessing the expertise of a notified body, and choose specifically the notified body designated for assessing your type of device. All in all, the whole roadmap for reaching the CE mark in Europe will be represented as you can see in the slide. Basically, the first part is this strategic part where you need to first assess what we have done so far, the qualification as a medical device or an IVD. This is reviewing whether the definition of medical device or IVD is applicable to you. Then, if so, conduct the classification analysis to see whether your device is of a class 1, class 2A, class 2B, or class 3. And then following this classification, identify primarily which will be the regulatory requirements. Once you have this first strategic part completed, then you can work in the two pillars that are essential for obtaining the final CE mark. These pillars are, on the one hand, talking about the manufacturer company, you need to define and implement a quality management system that needs to be reflecting all the regulatory obligation applicable for a medical device manufacturer as per the regulations. This is, as I said, regarding the manufacturer company. In parallel, regarding the specific product, you need to develop the so-called technical documentation. This technical documentation at the end will be the summary of all the evidence, the verification and validation activities, device description and specification, and all the labeling and instruction for use that demonstrate that your device in particular has shown compliance with the medical device regulation or the IVDR. Once you have both pillars completed, you then need to go through a conformity assessment with a notified body, if applicable. And after this conformity assessment has been conducted, you will obtain the CE mark. Okay. Now let's briefly review these two pillars, the QMS and the technical documentation contents. Before this, also I wanted to make the point of which are the different economic operators in the medtech industry. We have the manufacturer, which is at the end the owner of the product, is the final legal responsible of the product. And I have to emphasize that it doesn't need to be actually the company conducting in first hand the production of the device. Although the name is manufacturer, the name of the role is manufacturer, you may have the 100% of the production subcontracted, but still being the legal manufacturer of the device, because you are assuming all the legal responsibility for the device. Then we have the authorized representative, which is a role specifically appearing when the manufacturer is established outside the European Union. And basically, the authorized representative is the figure representing the manufacturer in European territory against the competent authorities when needed. Also, we have the two logistic economic operator roles, which are the distributors and the importers. In the case of the importers, they will be applicable when we have a medical device manufacturer which is established outside the European Union. Therefore, the importer will be that company making the first economic transaction between the foreign manufacturer and the importer as such established in the European Union. Once we have the product inside the European market, any intermediate between the importer or the final intended user, they will be considered distributors. Okay, so as I said, let's briefly review which are the two pillars of the CE mark conformity assessment process that were the quality management system and the technical documentation. Starting briefly with the quality management system, I have to say that the quality management system needs to be defined in accordance with the obligation reflected in Article 10 of the Medical Device Regulation or the IVDR. For this, in Europe, we typically rely on the compliance of a standard that at the end of the day represent the regulatory state of the art. So for the purposes of quality management system, we have the ISO 13485 that by complying with this standard, you also have presumption of conformity with the medical device regulation requirements for the quality management system. It's really important to make the point that although you have presumption of conformity, still there are some additional requirements included in the MDR or the IVDR that are extra requirements in addition to those reflected in the ISO 13485. Therefore, for your quality management system, you need to show compliance with the MDR and IVDR. You can rely also on ISO 13485, but bear in mind that there will be additional clauses of the MDR or the IVDR that you also need to cover. Basically, the typical areas that need to be reflected in the quality management system includes the quality management system organization, management responsibility, resource management, product realization, and measuring, analysis, and improvement. Also, as I said before, you as manufacturer need to cover in your quality management system all your responsibilities. So it doesn't matter that you have some process subcontracted, you need to control that process, subcontract it, and make sure that your quality management system is able to assess whether this process is conducted in accordance with the regulations. Let's briefly review the technical documentation contents. So the technical documentation does not have a fixed structure, but we can find in the Annex 2 of the medical device regulations the typical contents that we need to contain, okay? Before starting drafting the technical documentation, it's really important to assess with the notified body whether they do have a specific template for submitting the documentation, because for some cases they do have a fixed structure. But if not, you can stick to the Annex 2 points, okay? Basically, you have to have an area describing the technology and also its specifications. Here it includes the intended use, intended user, intended patient population, also which is the risk classification of your device, and which are the different versions or variants of your product. Specifically for medical devices, you need to talk about as well of how the different parts of the device are in contact, direct or indirect, with the human body. And in the case of the IVDs, you need to make a focus on which are the principles of the ACEs to detect the specific analytes. Then we have another module, which is regarding the instruction for use and the labeling. Basically, this part of the technical documentation shall include which is the IFU and the labeling that will be used by the final intended user, so that the notified body can assess how all the information is provided to the intended user and how the usability is ensured for this device. Then you need to have also the module of design and manufacturing, which basically defines which have been the design stages for your device, and also how is your manufacturing process conducted, and which are the validation process for your manufacturing of your device. Regarding the module 4, this is regarding general safety and performance requirements. This module is typically drafted in a tabular format, as you can see in the slide, and you have to go one by one, requirement per requirement of the regulation, describing whether the requirement is applicable or not to your device. For example, imagine that you have a non-sterile device, therefore requirement for a sterile device will not be applicable for you. And for those that are applicable, justify which had been the methodology to demonstrate compliance with that requirement, and also a cross-reference to the documentation where you have explained how you comply with that requirement. Another key module of the technical documentation is the benefit risk analysis and the risk management. Here you need to include all the risk management activities for assessing the risk that could be coming from the whole life cycle of your device, and how you have constructed controlling measure to reduce all these risks as far as possible. Here, the relevant standard is the ISO 14971. And finally, one of the final modules is regarding product verification and validation. In this module is where all the preclinical and clinical evidence shall be discussed, and also how your device has shown that in a real-world scenario is able to demonstrate compliance with the safety and the performance requirements. Another point that we wanted to highlight here in this presentation, when we have reviewed the quality management system and technical documentation, is the EUMed database. EUMed database is a centralized database that has been developed for the European Union medtech industry. Here, basically, you can see the different modules that are included in this database. You have module for the economic operators that we mentioned before, also module for register the devices as such, modules for notified bodies so that they can upload the certificates of the devices, module for vigilance and post-market. This module would be intended for reporting any safety issue regarding to the device. Clinical investigation, this is for applying for clinical studies for your device. And then marketer surveillance would be the module used by competent authorities to do this communication regarding the management of incidents. So this EUMed database has been a really ambitious project by the European Commission, and now is also in a transition stage. So far, we have this date, May 28th, which should be the date that will be defining the mandatory use of the module of device registration for those newly MDR certified devices. That means that if you have a medical device certified after this date, you then need automatically to register also your device in the EUMed database. For those devices that already have the CE mark before this date, there is a transition period until November this year, but it's really important that you start preparing to comply with these registration requirements in this database. That is a really exhaustive exercise, because you need to include a lot of information regarding your products that are commercialized in Europe. And finally, just some notes about post-market surveillance. Also, as part of the technical documentation, I wanted to make the point that you need to include the post-market surveillance activities that you plan for your device in Europe. These are the activities intended to collect evidences regarding the safety use of your device once in the market. So for this, you need to produce periodic reports that, depending on the risk classification of your device, are called PMS reports or PSUR. And basically, these periodic reports are periodically summarizing this safety data of the real-world data, and also re-evaluating the risk of your device based on this real-world data. And finally, just to close in this part of European medtech requirements, I wanted to close the session, this part, with the most common deficiencies that we see for medical devices in the industry. So first of all, we see that when they submit technical documentation to notified body, the documentation is incomplete because maybe some documentation is missing, or maybe it's not clearly identified. So for this, our recommendation is somehow empathize with the notified body reviewer, because the easier you make their task of reviewing, the more chances of success that you have. Also, a lack of cohesive structure of the technical documentation. Again, these dossiers can be really long. So the more clear structure that you present for this documentation, the easier will be to identify all the required evidences. Also, misalignment between documents. Remember that there could be a really close relationship between different documentation in the technical documentation. So whenever you have to do a cross-reference, please make sure that you identify correctly the document that you want to cross-reference. Also, this is a critical deficiency, a lack of adequate sufficient clinical data to demonstrate safety and performance. So for this, I want everybody to assess which is the clinical data that they have to support the safety and performance for their device, and assess whether they are to the level required by the regulations, because with this new regulation, the requirements or the expectation for notified bodies has been increased a lot. Finally, absence of clear defined clinical safety and performance parameters, and for sure, an insufficient link between clinical evaluation and risk management process, because at the end, you need to consistently demonstrate that your device have a good safety and performance profile in accordance with the regulation requirements.